In the heat of August 1951, the quiet medieval village of Pont-Saint-Esprit sat perfectly still. It was a rustic community in southern France, heavily reliant on tradition and routine. For generations, the rhythm of life here had never changed. The town awoke with the ringing of the church bells, and the very first stop for most families was the local bakery. Bread was the absolute foundation of the rural French diet. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was entirely safe, or at least it had been safe for centuries. On August 16th, something shifted. It did not begin with a loud explosion or a visible threat. It began quietly, inside the bodies of the people who had eaten the morning bread. By nightfall, the local doctor's office was overwhelmed. Patients arrived complaining of vicious stomach pains, freezing chills, and a terrible, suffocating feeling of anxiety that they could not explain. At first, medical officials assumed it was a simple case of widespread food poisoning. A bad batch of flour, perhaps. But food poisoning does not make you lose your mind. Over the next 48 hours, the physical sickness mutated into severe, inescapable psychological horror. The village of Pont-Saint-Esprit was rapidly descending into an absolute, collective nightmare. Hundreds of villagers began experiencing violently terrifying hallucinations. The visions were not mild or hazy. They were vivid, visceral, and deeply rooted in paranoia and physical torture. One man barricaded himself in his stone cellar, screaming that his internal organs were actively rotting inside of him, begging the doctor to cut his stomach open. A young child woke in the middle of the night, thrashing wildly in his bed, convinced that venomous snakes were bursting from his skin and wrapping around his throat. Women ran into the streets screaming that their children had been turned into sausages. Men claimed their heads had been hollowed out and replaced with molten lead. The local hospital quickly ran out of beds. They resorted to strapping patients directly to heavy iron radiators just to keep them from tearing at their own flesh. The madness was highly contagious, or so it seemed. Neighbors who had been perfectly sane in the morning were completely psychotic by the afternoon. The town was entirely quarantined. Perhaps the most terrifying symptom was the intense, violent insomnia. The afflicted could not sleep. They remained awake, trapped in a waking nightmare for up to a week straight. Exhaustion combined with absolute terror pushed the human mind to its breaking point. One man, believing he was a magnificent airplane, violently threw himself from a second-story window. He shattered both of his legs on the cobblestones below. Yet, fueled by the terrifying chemistry in his brain, he stood back up and attempted to run away on his broken bones. By the end of the week, the asylum in the nearby city was overflowing with screaming residents from Pont-Saint-Esprit. Straitjackets were in short supply. Sedatives proved entirely useless. Medical professionals were absolutely baffled. They drew blood, they analyzed vomit, they tested the local water supply. Nothing made logical, biological sense. 5 people died in the chaos, their bodies giving out from the sheer, unrelenting stress of the hallucinations. Over 300 people were severely afflicted. The village was broken. Investigators desperately needed a scapegoat. They traced the outbreak back to its only common denominator, the bread from a single specific bakery in the center of town. The baker, Roger Arnold, was immediately arrested. The press quickly dubbed his product le Pain Maudit, the cursed bread. The entire nation of France watched the investigation unfold. Under intense interrogation, Arnold claimed he was innocent. He stated he had used the exact same flour, the exact same yeast, and the exact same ovens he had used for years, but investigators found a biological suspect. They theorized the flour had been contaminated by a dark parasitic fungus that grows on damp rye, known as ergot. Ergot has a terrifying history in Europe. During the Middle Ages, outbreaks of ergot poisoning were known as St. Anthony's fire due to the intense burning sensation it caused in the limbs. Historically, ergot poisoning causes gangrene. Blood vessels strictly constrict, fingers and toes turn completely black, and the rotting flesh literally falls off the victim's body. It also contains natural psychoactive compounds, which can cause delirium. For decades, the official government narrative stated that Pont-Saint-Esprit was simply the victim of a medieval fungus. Case closed. The baker was blamed, the flour was destroyed, and the traumatized village was left alone to rebuild their shattered minds. But the medical data did not fit the story. Several top toxicologists privately reviewed the case and found massive, glaring inconsistencies. The symptoms in Pont-Saint-Esprit were entirely wrong for standard ergot poisoning. None of the villagers developed the black, rotting gangrene that is the universal hallmark of severe ergot ingestion. Their flesh remained perfectly intact. Furthermore, natural ergot cannot survive the extreme heat of a baker's oven. The baking process neutralizes the toxic alkaloids. The medieval theory was biologically impossible, yet the French authorities refused to reopen the investigation. The ergot theory, however flawed, was the accepted truth. The real cause remained buried for over 50 years. To understand the true nightmare of Pont-Saint-Esprit, we must look away from the bakery and look toward the most secretive and ruthless organization of the 1950s, the CIA. In 1951, the Cold War was escalating rapidly. The United States government was absolutely terrified that the Soviet Union was developing advanced chemical mind control weapons. In response, the CIA launched a deeply classified, highly illegal program aimed at discovering their own truth serum and psychological warfare drugs. They needed a chemical that could completely break a human mind. They needed a drug that could cause immediate, weaponized hysteria in an enemy population. Their search led them directly to Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland and to a brilliant chemist named Albert Hofmann, who had recently synthesized a terrifying new compound. The compound was derived from the ergot fungus, but it was chemically altered, purified, and infinitely more powerful. It was odorless, tasteless, and completely invisible. It was called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. In 1951, it was the most potent, concentrated hallucinogen on the face of the earth. The CIA bought the entire global supply of LSD from Sandoz laboratories. They had the weapon, but to understand its true destructive power, they needed to test it. They could not test a weaponized mass hysteria drug on an American city. They needed an isolated rural population, a place where an outbreak could be easily contained and monitored. Decades later, a journalist uncovered heavily redacted CIA documents referencing a massive secret field experiment conducted in August 1951. The documents explicitly mentioned the village of Pont-Saint-Esprit. They did not mention ergot. They mentioned the successful covert deployment of a psychoactive compound. The theory is chillingly simple. American intelligence agents, working alongside the Sandoz Chemical Company, deliberately contaminated the local baker's flour supply with liquid LSD. The extreme heat of the baker's oven destroys natural ergot, but synthetic LSD is incredibly resilient. The drug baked directly into the crust of the morning bread. The villagers did not have medieval food poisoning. They were unknowingly subjected to a massive military-grade acid trip, with absolutely no context or understanding of what was happening to their brains. When a person does not know they have been drugged, the hallucinations are not perceived as a trip. They are perceived as a sudden, permanent, psychotic break with reality. This explains why the symptoms so perfectly mirrored the effects of pure LSD, the violent insomnia, the intense paranoia, the feeling of flying, and the absolute absence of physical gangrene. Declassified notes from the Sandoz Chemical Company confirmed that their scientists were dispatched to Pont-Saint-Esprit immediately after the outbreak began. They did not go to cure the villagers. They went to secretly observe the efficacy of their new chemical weapon on a live, unaware population. They walked through the screaming hospital wards, documenting the exact dosage requirements needed to completely fracture the social order of a small town. Once the data was collected, the intelligence agents vanished, leaving the French government to blindly pursue the false ergot theory. The cover-up was flawless. This horrifying event laid the groundwork for Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's infamous decades-long program of illegal human experimentation and psychological torture. For the CIA, Pont-Saint-Esprit was a massive success. It proved that a single operative could disable an entire city using nothing but their food supply. But for the villagers, the nightmare never truly ended. Even after the drug left their systems, the profound psychological trauma of that week lingered for decades. People who had tried to kill their own children, men who had thrown themselves from buildings, they had to wake up and continue living next to each other. They lived the rest of their lives believing their minds were fragile, believing that madness could return at any moment, hidden entirely in the mundane. The baker, Roche Arnold, was ruined. Despite the lack of evidence, he carried the blame for the deaths of his neighbors until his own death. The French government officially denies the CIA's involvement to this day. They maintain against all toxicological evidence that it was simply bad flour. The CIA has never publicly confirmed or denied the dosing of Pont-Saint-Esprit. The files that might offer absolute proof were destroyed in 1973, when the director of the CIA ordered the MK-Ultra files burned. A massive chunk of mid-century history was permanently erased from existence. What remains is a chilling intersection of real history and undeniable conspiracy. A town treated not as human beings, but as expendable laboratory rats. The event stands as a grim reminder of the depths to which desperate governments will sink in the name of national security and invisible warfare. The true terror of Pont-Saint-Esprit is not the hallucination itself. It is the realization that reality can be stolen from you without your consent. You can do everything right. You can wake up, go to work, buy your morning bread, and still be drafted into a secret, invisible war. The victims never received justice. They never received an apology. They were simply observed, documented, and abandoned to their engineered insanity. Today the village is quiet again. The cobblestones are clean, the asylum records are locked away, gathering thick layers of archival dust. But the memory of the cursed bread still haunts the older generations. It is a story whispered, rarely spoken aloud, passed down like a dark fable. It asks a question that remains universally terrifying. When the mind breaks entirely, who is holding the hammer? Was it an accident of nature? A medieval fungus returning from the Dark Ages to claim 5 lives in a forgotten French town? Or was it the dawn of a new terrifying era of warfare, where the most dangerous weapon on earth was hidden inside a simple, quiet loaf of bread?